Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are going to be doing episode 3 of the multi-series video series, So You Want to Be a MATLAB God. In today's episode, we are going to be talking about if statements. So let's start off with why you would want to use an if statement. Let's say you have a certain condition in some algorithm you're trying to write, and you want to check if that condition is met. And then if that condition is met, you either have something pop up that shows that that condition is met, or you can run a certain line of code. And then for other cases, you can have it run a different line of code if a different set of conditions are run. So let's say, for instance, that we're going to make a variable a, and we're going to say it is equal to 1. And we're going to do an if statement in MATLAB. And to do that, we do if, and we're going to say a is equal to 1. And then we're going to use disp, and then we're going to say a is equal to 1, and then end. So within this if statement, it's important to note that if you want things to be equal, you use the double equal sign. And then you can say a is equal to 1, and as you can see in here, we get a is equal to 1. And so another way you can also do is you can say a is greater than 1, and as you can see, a is not greater than 1, a is equal to 1, and so when it does it, it doesn't display. But if a equals 1.1, we can see that it then displays. And so you can also do greater than or equal to, and so you can do a is greater than or equal to 1, and then it also displays a is equal to 1 here. So that's really cool. Another thing we can do is we can have else ifs, which if there's another condition that you are also looking for, you can account for that in the same set of if statements. And so we type else if a is, say, less than 0. And then we're going to say disp a is less than 0. And so now let's make a 0, or -1. And as you can see, it says a is less than 0. So that's really cool. So now let's say that neither of these conditions are met. And in this case, that would be if a is somewhere between 0 and less than 1. But it can be any statement really, for that matter. We can do an else statement. So if all of these ifs, the first if and the else ifs are not met, it will then run this else statement, which is important to note that you do not need to have an else statement within your if statement. But depending on what you're doing, you may want one. And so we're going to disp, and we're going to say the other criterion are not met. And so now we are going to make a equal to 0, and as you can see, this statement is false, this statement is also false, and so it should display the other criterion are not met. And as you can see, it does so. Another cool thing we can do with the if statements is they also work for strings. So if we say a is equal to hello, we can then change our if statement to say if a is equal to hello, we can then display good input. As you can see, that works. However, it is important to note that strings are kind of weird, and it's better to use the function strcmp to compare strings, which lets you compare a string to a string that you're testing for. Because otherwise, if the strings are not the same length, MATLAB doesn't like that. Just something to keep in mind. So also another cool thing we can do is we can have multiple conditions within the same if statement. So let's make a equal to 1 again, and then we are going to make b equal to 2. And let's say that our criteria is we want to display a little text saying that we have a good input if a is equal to 1 and b is equal to 2. So we can do that, and we can say if a is equal to 1, and then for an and statement, we do double ampersand, and b is equal to 2. And then we're going to disp good input. And then to close that off, of course, again, we type end. And so we can see that a is equal to 1 and b equals to 2, and so this statement is true. And so as we expect, we get our command window and it says good input. So another thing we can do is OR statements, and to do this we do double pipes. And so now let's say a has to be equal to 55 or b is equal to 2. And as we can see, a is equal to 1, not equal to 55, so this part of the statement is not true, but because it's an OR statement, only one of these has to be true for the whole statement to be true. But as we can see, b is equal to 2, and so once again, this input, this if statement is true. And so we go and run it again, and as you can see, we get the good input. But now let's say b is equal to 3 actually, and as you can see, it outputs nothing down here in the command window. So we can do even more wacky stuff inside the if statement. We can have, say, a has to be equal to 2 or b equals 3, and a times b has to be, say, greater than 8. And so you can have statements like this. And for MATLAB's order of operations with ands and or statements is it will take and as the first statement. So the statement here reads, if b is equal to 3 and a times b is greater than 8, or a equals 2. So if a equals 2, this whole statement is true. Otherwise, b has to be greater than 3 and a times b has to be greater than 8. So as you can see, we have a equals 1 right now, and then b equals 3. So b equals 3 and a times b is not greater than 8 in this case. So looking at this, it should not run the good input command, little output. So we run it, and of course it doesn't. But let's make b or a equal to, say, 4. And so now a times b is 12, which is greater than 8. And so b is equal to 3 and a times b is 12, which is greater than 8. And so now it should say good input. And as you can see, it does. And so there's a lot of things you can do with these if statements, and you can have lots of else ifs and an else statement, and very useful depending on what you are doing. So another thing we can do is we can use what is called a switch. And so it's a lot like an if statement, and you can accomplish what switch does with if statements. However, switch is a much cleaner way of doing it. So we're going to delete this, we're going to get rid of these, and we're going to make a new variable x, and we're going to say it is input, and it is give me a number. And we're going to assume that we have a good input, and we are going to do what is called switch, and we're going to call switch x. And so now we're going to have what are called cases, and we're going to have, say, case 1. And then for case 1, we are going to have disp, and we're just going to have 1. And then let's make another one. We're going to have case 2, and we're going to disp 2. And then just like with if statements, we use end to close it all off. And so what this is going to do is if the user inputs 1, it's going to display 1, and if it inputs 2, it's going to display 2. So let's give it a try real quick. So it says give me a number, I'm going to give it 1, and of course right here it gives us 1. Let's run it one more time, say give it 2, and then it spits out 2. However, it's important to note that if we give it neither of them, MATLAB's not going to error, it's just not going to run any of these cases. So unlike, say, with if statements, you can't necessarily do else with a switch. So let's give it 22, and it does nothing. So switch is very nice if you are trying to make a program that has like a menu system. So if you have a menu with multiple things for a user to select, you can use switch because you know what all the cases are going to be, and you can have it easily go through it, and it's a lot cleaner looking and a little easier to program than using a bunch of if statements. So that is all I have for this episode. I hope you learned something useful and that you enjoyed. If you did, please like, favorite, subscribe, and stay tuned for upcoming episodes. Thanks for watching.